progress to having a career in nursing, and science kind of becomes your foundational belief system. You believe in science, you believe in progress, you believe that knowledge is constantly expanding, and to have that belief system challenged, to recognize that actually a lot of this supposed science is only marketing propaganda, and it's really, really hard to tease out what the actual truth is. That's challenging foundational beliefs, and it's really uncomfortable.
Welcome to Love and Life. I'm Dr. Karen Anderson Abril, here with my co-host,
Pastor Elliot Anderson.
And Love and Life is your place to hear conversations grounded in psych research, psychotherapy,
and biblical truth
to help us thrive in love and life. Dave, welcome back to the program.
Happy to be here, Karen.
Oh, it's so great to see you again. We just had so much common ground in the last episodes. I want to refer anyone who isn't familiar with you and your work to check out episodes 298 and 299, where you talked about your journey from being a psychiatric nurse who was very pro-pharma, as most psychiatric nurses are, and then really seeing the effects of these folks who are in a spot of needing treatment and care and nurturing for their mental health concerns, and yet being so overly medicated that any potential for healing seemed to be the drugs seem to be an impediment to that. And I loved hearing your heart about that. As you know, and our community knows, this is such a passion point for me. And sadly, Elliot was not able to join us today. We were going to talk about, and I hope that you'll be able to join us again to make sure we do cover this, because one of the things that we talked about, and I can't remember if we talked about it on the episode or after the episode, that through your protesting throughout COVID, as mine as well, we did see many people either kind of awakening to spiritual concerns that maybe they hadn't paid much attention to before, or it seemed that those who were the dissidents did have that firm, solid foundation in a connection to God that seemed to fortify them in the midst of an enormous amount of propaganda and oppression that you and I can talk to as well. And we were just, before getting on the program or before recording, we were talking about some of our favorite dissidents who have emerged, someone like Russell Brand, who I now listen to his podcast every day and I admire. He's having a spiritual awakening where he's just recently been baptized. And I just love seeing these people. One of my favorite things as a former, I was never registered ever as a political party, but I used to vote Democrat. I've voted for both parties, and I'm now a big fan of RFKJ, independent. I would love to see a third party representation. 71% of Americans would also like to see this. But I love seeing this coalition of people who go, we may differ on this and that, but we don't differ on the core, most profound elements and values, like free speech, like you don't censor someone just because they're not going along. A professional, a doctor, someone like you, a psychiatric nurse with all these years of experience, your tweets are getting censored, your posts are getting censored because you're not going along with the doctrine from Lord Fauci. I love seeing all of us come together under free speech, medical freedom, fighting against these institutions that are supposed to regulate big pharma and big ag and keep us healthy, and in fact are in bed with these corporations. I love seeing us all coalescing, and so let's talk more about that. Especially, I wanted to ask you, Dave, what are you seeing on your end of things? I'm getting a little encouragement, and like I'm scared to be excited, but to see people like Callie and Casey Means coming out on big platforms and talking about how unhealthy we are. And even with RFKJ linking arms with Trump to a degree, I'm not sure how much of a degree that will be, but the MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again. I got so excited I went on Etsy and bought like 3 t-shirts because I was like, this is my kind of people. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I'm excited, just like you are, to see RFKJ join with Trump. I was a big fan of RFKJ. One of my apprehensions about second Trump term was that the biggest failure of his first term was he had all sorts of swampy deep state people around him during his administration, and they backstabbed him and undermined any chance of him to actually drain the swamp. Whereas with RFKJ, I think he has a real shot at doing that. And the way that Trump was still like supporting the COVID vaccines and saying that Project Warp Speed was a huge success, that was really leaving a bad taste in my mouth.
Yes.
And did not like to hear that from him. So seeing RFKG on board and then seeing Tulsi Gabbard on board as well gives me a lot of hope. But like you, it also worries me too, because the forces that they're up against, the Washington establishment, the uniparty that doesn't care who the president is, as long as it's an establishment choice, like a Biden, like a Harris, like a Nikki Haley, their back is going to be against the wall if they see somebody like Trump and RFK taking over power in Washington. And we know that they're capable of some pretty awful things. So that makes me a little worried about what the next few upcoming months will bring. But I am heartened that we have a free speech platform like X now. Some of the revelations that have come out of there's even a newer release of Twitter files that Alex Berenson just released that I haven't gotten to dive into yet, but it involves Scott Gottlieb, who was the former FDA commissioner who then left to join the board at Pfizer, and he gave all these interviews on MSNBC during the pandemic where they would introduce him as former FDA commissioner instead of current Pfizer board member. He was also instrumental in a lot of the censorship that was happening too, along with the federal government, where they were contacting social media platforms and saying, take down this, even though they knew that a lot of those posts were actually true. So one of the interesting things about the age of COVID is that it has woken a lot of people up, and we've seen people change in real time. We've seen them on these journeys, people like Russell Brand, people like Dr. Drew. We've seen Naomi Wolf go on Tucker Carlson and have an incredible civil conversation for over an hour about all the things they have in common. That absolutely was not possible in 2019. And for myself and a lot of the people I know, we're different people than we were in 2019 as well. COVID really accelerated things. What do you think?
Oh my gosh, I'm just over here nodding my head vociferously. Just yes. It excites me because I do believe that part of, I don't know if the algorithms, I don't know, but however things, or whether just Trump broke so many people's brains. I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. I voted for the libertarian Gary Johnson. I wanted to see a third party. I certainly wasn't going to vote for Hillary because just many reasons. But I was looking for that third party representation. But once he got in office, I was like, okay, I've always been curious since Ross Perot day. I was like, let's see what a businessman can do. I could see some business acumen be very helpful with things like, the economy, which is what most people really care about. And so I just was appalled by how the minute this man got like the night of his when he won, the next morning the Washington Post had "It's time to impeach Trump" article, and I thought, this is crazy. We've never been so polarized that we would just say, not my president. So something about that shift, then with everyone being so polarized as you were speaking to, and then COVID coming in and initially not unifying us at all, but then finding that unity, to your point. Like, Naomi Wolf published all the Pfizer documents with Steve Bannon. I mean,
right.
I'm like, this is like a feminist who was way over here in our day coming up, and now she's there with Steve, which they were both too polarized for me personally. I was more in the middle of either of their rhetoric or their concerns, and then I'm like, but wait a minute, they're coming together? Now there's something interesting here, and truly unifying. And that's what Trump and RFKJ were talking about, truly trying to find a unity party. And goodness, with Tulsi Gabbard coming in, who's so well respected. But here's the thing, Dave, and I'm curious what you're seeing. My friends on the left, none of this matters to them. It's still Trump derangement syndrome. He is bad orange man. So anyone who joins him for that common ground agenda, like make us healthy again, must be a sellout.
Yeah, it's interesting. And there's a lot of parallels between Trump derangement syndrome and people who haven't kind of woken up to the transgressions during the COVID era. It's like the people who have Trump derangement syndrome are probably getting this 10th booster that just came out. And I think a lot about that because, it's really important to reach these people. It's important that things aren't so divided in this country. And it's really important for our health because the way things are going with the medical industrial complex, we are facing an absolute existential crisis with our health in this country, not because, COVID vaccines are killing all these people. The jury's still out on just how bad they are, but because of things like diabetes, cases of obesity exploding, cases of autism exploding. The fertility rate is below replacement level. Like we're literally declining as a population, except for the amount of people crossing the southern border illegally. If it weren't for millions and millions of people crossing the border illegally, our overall population would be in decline, which is not a good thing. Life expectancy is down, not a good thing. And these are existential threats, each of them individually, and all of them together are an absolute emergency. And we seem to see no interest from the federal government in getting to the bottom of any of these crises. Hey, why do so many people in our population have cancer? Why do so many people in our population have diabetes? Why are the citizens of our country dying younger and younger and younger every year? Why do so many of their kids have autism? Why is autism increasing exponentially? We see no interest from the federal government in getting to the bottom of any of these questions. And when you start to pull on the threads, it's a lot of the same names that start coming up. And I'm not going to pretend that I have an answer to all of those questions as to what's causing them, but it's the same few industries who seem to be the prime suspects. It's either big pharma, it's big food, big ag with the things that they spray on our food with the glyphosate and all the other food additives that are allowed in this country that aren't allowed anywhere else in the world. It's big chemical. It's one of these giant industries, or multiple of them, or all of them are killing us. And we need to figure out who it is, and we need to stop allowing them to prioritize profits over the health of our country and our children.
What scares me is that it looks like because so many of these companies are now actually, they've been gobbled up by these big investment firms, if I'm using that term correctly. I don't know a lot about finance. But so BlackRock, maybe they own the major shares of both Monsanto and also Pfizer. So here we go, we'll poison you on the one hand, and then we'll create a cancer drug to cure you later, and we win on both ends.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of pulling threads and hearing the same names and things like that, part of what's been so influential to me over the past few years and has really changed how I see the world is the entire Jeffrey Epstein saga and the things that have happened with that. That's been something that's been so difficult to understand. Like, how can this be the country that we live in where we know that this person was trafficking children for rich people, powerful people, influential scientists, people in Hollywood, but we don't get to find out who any of them are, and none of them are held accountable for what they did. And we know that there are literally hundreds of thousands of children being trafficked across our southern border, and we're just keeping the gates locked wide open. How is this America? This is unbelievable. And when you look at things like COVID and like censorship, I routinely get censored on social media. One of the criteria that they put in place over the course of COVID was that you're not allowed to link any healthcare information that isn't from an official government source. That, for example, was in the YouTube terms of service, and that's how they justified a lot of the censorship that happened on the Google platforms. Over on Facebook and Instagram, owned by Meta, a lot of the same thing. They took down so many posts that conflicted with the official narrative, but it would just happen. It would just happen automatically. But you know what they weren't taking down? They weren't taking down child pornography. They weren't taking down posts related to child sex trafficking. They put all this effort into censoring true information about vaccine injuries and things like that, but they didn't put that same effort into shutting down child sex trafficking and child pornography. There's a not a class action lawsuit. There's a multitude of state attorney generals who have a lawsuit going against Meta because of this, because they're so willing to facilitate predatory behaviors against children. Meanwhile, they're not doing anything to, they're not doing anything to shut down these predatory behaviors, but they will censor the hell out of you if you post something that goes against official narratives.
It just makes me speechless.
Yeah. It's part of how, when we talk about spiritual awakening, it's like there really seem to be forces at work in the world that you can only describe as evil. I kind of started down that path and that mindset when I started to dive into these pharma scandals that we talked about the last time you and I had a conversation, where it's like when you really look at the details that are revealed in some of the lawsuits, where people sit around in a boardroom and they go, well, we can hide these cardiac side effects, and they do that, and they put a product on the market and it's killing people by the tens of thousands, and they know it, and they lie about it, and they're just doing it all for profit. It's hard to attach a label to that doesn't include evil. It's changed me as a person. It's made me a totally different person from where I was 10 years ago before I started reading about these lawsuits, and it's I think it's part of why we still see these people who wake up. We see these people who don't wake up, and they are in stark contrast to the people who do. I think that one of the reasons people kind of stay asleep is because it's so uncomfortable. Yeah. It's because it's so much easier to go through life saying, I trust this authority. I can trust the authorities. I can believe what I see. I can believe what I read in the newspaper. When I turn on the evening news, I can believe all that. And my world becomes far too complicated and uncomfortable if I acknowledge that they're actually lying to me and don't care whether I live or die, or don't care whether my children live or die. I'm coming to understand why people just want to keep the blinders on. They don't want to know these things that we know. They want to, ignorance is bliss. Yeah. And they prefer to live in ignorance. And I get that. It's a recurring theme with the doctors that I've come to respect over the last few years too. You kind of see them on this journey where they are immersed in the system. They are a system doctor. And then all of a sudden, they start to see things that just become undeniable to them, that the system is broken, and it's very uncomfortable for them, and it's hard on their careers. So, Pierre Corey comes to mind, Dr. McCullough, Dr. Drew's one who's been on a journey, and, he made it a point to platform people who've been censored and listen to what they have to say. He's somebody who used to be a huge fan of Dr. Fauci, from back during the AIDS epidemic, and now he's learned all these things that you can fact check and look at that make you just go, this is actually really dark and uncomfortable, because I'm having to unlearn so much, and it creates so much instability in how you see the world, and it challenges axiomatic beliefs. Like for me, we went to church when I was a kid, and I learned kind of the biblical stories, things like that, and they didn't necessarily seem all that applicable to modern life. That's kind of the mindset I had back then, and progressed to having a career in nursing, and science kind of becomes your foundational belief system. You believe in science, you believe in progress, you believe that knowledge is constantly expanding, and to have that belief system challenged, to recognize that actually a lot of this supposed science is only marketing propaganda, and it's really, really hard to tease out what the actual truth is, that's challenging foundational beliefs, and it's really uncomfortable. So I think there were a multitude of people where their foundational beliefs were biblical going into COVID, and they were kind of ahead of the curve of a lot of other people. And those who had this foundational belief in science kind of undercut over the course of their careers in medicine or otherwise, are kind of looking for something, and maybe they're finding it. Maybe they're finding it in religion.
You hit on so many points that I want to underscore and have you speak to a little bit more in depth. For example, I've recently heard, and again, this is a flip-flop from when we were kids, that currently, if you're on the left, if you're on the blue team, as Dr. Brett Weinstein calls it, you have high trust in our institutions, from all the three-letter agencies all the way down to even corporations. And then when I was a child, it was my Democrat father who taught me to be very skeptical of all institutions, and certainly big corporations that were out to make money. Certainly, he was the one who taught me, I'm sure I mentioned that before, about big pharma being in bed with the medical community. And so the pharmaceutical rep would wine and dine the doc to make sure that he pushed her pills. And it's very transactional, and it keeps them very much, like you said, very much more concerned about profit than actually helping people. And again, I don't think the doctors set out to, that's not their goal when they're in med school, but they're indoctrinated in this medical complex that, as Casey Means has said, doesn't have anything to do with nutrition or actually root causes. Or even, I know Kamala Harris came out saying, well, we're going to tackle the price of insulin for our diabetics. I'm thinking, why don't we tackle the fact that everyone's got diabetes? Like, can we just go back a moment? Like, getting us to have meds be more affordable is not tackling the actual problem. So when you're talking about those institutions and the trust they're in, it turns out that people who were dissidents had lack of trust in institutions in general, but you also said they had a faith from a lot of the folks that you ended up meeting during COVID dissident protests and so forth. And I think that's interesting. So they have trust, maybe not all of them, all dissidents, and some are finding God, but there was a core that were skeptical of these entities, of the establishment, and were willing to let, like you said, it's very hard to let go of this notion that these people who've been public servants, like Fauci, working for NIH since he was a young doctor, probably in his 20s or early 30s, it's really hard to let go of the belief that he actually doesn't care about the American people. He's really much more interested in his own career, and he makes a lot of money off the patents, and that's something that we need to address when we get in there, please, Lord Jesus, to dismantle all these carve-outs in politics, from the childhood vaccine schedule. If you get a drug on the vaccine, call it a vaccine and get it on the CDC schedule, you're not liable for any adverse events, including autism or whatever else might happen to children. And also, there is this was established in order, ostensibly, to help researchers be more motivated to create therapeutics that would help. But I believe it's something with NIH, and then the researchers can make, and you might know more about this being in the field, can make a profit on drugs that come to market based on their research, even in their institutions like universities and so forth. So all that to say, there's too many other incentives that get in the way. And to your point about a spiritual battle, if you're a Christian, it sounds mean, but you believe that that without God to redeem us, we're evil. We are selfish. We're going to take the route that's going to benefit us. So when you have that worldview, you go, yeah, your power corrupts absolutely, absolute power corrupts, or whatever that term is. Maybe that was an easier step for Christians to take, or people of faith of some sort, throughout COVID, to go, I don't trust these people, and I've got God I trust, and so I have the strength to be a dissident. I mean, I just went with a lot of the things you said and just kind of underscored them, but speak to that, any of the above.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when we were out on the picket line outside my hospital, holding up signs that said things like respect for informed consent, and I'm chatting with people that I've never met before, but we just have this in common, that we are so opposed to these mandates. We're so opposed to, being told you have to do this to keep your job. And chatting with the people out there, it was very disproportionate how many of them were homeschooled and how many of them were church going. And I was neither of those things at that point, but it still kind of like planted a seed, like, okay, what's going on here that such a disproportionate number of the people out here who are opposed to mandates were homeschooled and are church going, versus the people who are the most adamantly in favor of mandates are also very hardcore leftist Democrat types. There's something going on here, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it and still trying to suss out what's going on here, what we're seeing.
We are thrilled to announce our partnership with Authentics Athletic Apparel, spelled with 2 X's at the end, because it's our XX chromosomes that make us female. And contrary to current belief, no amount of hormones, no number of surgeries can change that. And no female athlete should have to compete against men. But at the moment, this is exactly what's happening in both amateur and professional sports. It's not fair, nor is it safe. Wearing Authentics lets us take a stand to support and protect female athletes. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to say it, we're protecting the future of womanhood. Authentics gives 10% of all sales to the Independent Women's Forum, the nonprofit which fights for women's causes, including our right to our own spaces and our right to compete against other women and only other women. Check out Authentics.com and use promo code LOVELIFE for 10% off your purchase. That's Authentics.com, AUTHENTIXX.com, and use promo code LOVELIFE, all one word, for 10% off your purchase. Yeah, I too, and that's why I really get energized and excited to speak with someone like you who's grappling with these same questions, because none of it makes sense. There's these 180 shifts that so many, some of the Substacks I read, there was a man writing about how he had, and it was in the it was 2015. He was in Austin, Texas, or somewhere down south, and was at this big march against glyphosate, against Monsanto poisoning us, giving us cancer by allowing these herbicides and pesticides to be on our crops. And he's like, oh, it was all these hippies, or all these people who would be on the left. And now that shifted so much to where even things like human trafficking that you spoke to earlier too, there's this movie, The Sound of Freedom, that I saw, Angel Studios put it out. And I was telling my friend, she and I both have a history of working in child welfare in the inner city of Chicago. And I said, oh, it's such a great movie. And she's on the left, and I thought it would be a common ground. Like, one thing we can agree on, we hate that children are trafficked. And she came back with something like, well, Republicans are part of that mess too. And I had to remind her, I'm not a Republican, A. B, of course. And I keep reminding her, it's a uniparty. I don't believe that, I would say 95% of the people who are currently in public office are not don't align with my values in multiple myriad ways and in different factions of what I really care about. Because if they had, we wouldn't have seen what we saw in COVID. But it made me sad that now it's like caring about sex trafficking of children and taking an honest look at what's happening at the border. If it's correct, I know RFKJ went down there because he said he's hearing a lot, but he actually went down. I have not been to the border. But from what I hear from sources I trust, we have missing children, and many children are being trafficked, including women as well. And to care about that is now a right-wing position?
Yeah, it's crazy that things like that become politicized. And when you look at these right-wing versus left-wing issues, part of what I try to keep in mind, because I'm very outspoken about gender-affirming care. I've been working with adolescents in a psychiatric setting for over a decade now. This is something that I've put a ton of time into researching, and I've come to the conclusion that this is an absolute abomination, that there's incredible damage being done to children on a very widespread scale, and I'm very outspoken about that and passionate about it. But at the same time, when you look at issues like gender affirming care, when you look at issues like abortion, these kind of culture war hot topics, these kind of really incendiary issues that get people fired up, I do believe that to some extent these are distractions from bigger issues that we face, from the fact that we essentially have a uniparty, that they give us this kind of illusion of arguing back and forth between red and blue and arguing on these culture war topics, where the real problem is that we have a uniparty establishment in Washington, that it doesn't matter who gets elected. It doesn't matter who the voters choose, that these predatory and manipulative people are there permanently, and there's nothing we can do about it unless we get somebody really disruptive into office. And they are trying so hard to make sure that that's not even possible by completely controlling what we're allowed to see, what we're allowed to hear, by completely by essentially removing the First Amendment to free speech, by making sure that social media platforms only push allowed narratives. And we have seen a huge change in the Democratic Party, and I think it started back in the 90s with the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, who was much friendlier to corporations. And at that point in time, we went from having a Republican Party who was very friendly to corporations to having two parties who were very friendly to corporations, and those corporations have taken over. And like you said, you pull the strings, and all of a sudden you get to just a few names like BlackRock and Vanguard, and these are global scale forces at work that are taking over these systems and making it impossible for voters who check a box on November 5th to actually have anything that they want enacted in Washington. We'll all be distracted by things like gender affirming care and abortion, and we just ignore the way that there's an economic war being waged against us. There's a war on our health being waged against us, and we're just supposed to ignore that while we argue about abortion and things like that.
Yeah, I've tried to share with most of my friends on the left don't want to talk to me pretty much about anything other than like the weather or something, because they don't want to go into. I get it. It's like you said earlier. They have a world that they've constructed, and to me, it's a house of cards, and they don't want it. They don't want that tumbling down. And I get it. They've got kids to raise. They've got things. They don't want their worldview shattered. They don't want to know what we know. Who wants to know it? I mean, it's not fun to be like, yeah, these institutions are pretty much trying to kill us at every turn. And
yeah, exactly.
I think, so when I try to say to anyone who will talk to me, like, I really think this left versus right, to your point you made a moment ago, is a distraction that's useful for the powers that be to keep us at each other. Can you explain? Because I'm not having a pithy way of explaining that to anyone who is willing to listen, because I don't know that maybe they just don't understand. Like, I view a lot of what America has done now. It's really sad. I had to dismantle my notion of my country, and a lot of the wars we've been in that I believed that we were justified. We were going to go fight the communists, and now I look back and go, or were we just going to make Lockheed and Raytheon a lot of money?
Yeah, exactly. It's just like acknowledging that a lot of the medical industrial complex is in it for the money and not in it for outcomes. When you start to look at the military industrial complex and the wars that America has been involved in, and you start to peel back the layers of that onion, it gets really uncomfortable, because, man, I liked growing up in the 80s and 90s, where it was like, America's awesome and America's the good guys in the world, and the Cold War is over, and there's this guy over there, Saddam Hussein, and he's a real bad guy and we've got to take him out. And you start to learn about these things, just like learning about these boardroom meetings at pharma companies where they decide to kill tens of thousands of people. You learn about things like, the Gulf of Tonkin. We did the U.S. military had a false flag event because they wanted to get involved in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So that entire war was based off a lie. You look at more recently, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and how all that panned out, and what we. There's a difference. There's an important distinction between we were wrong and we lied, and what we keep finding out over and over in terms of these big scandals, whether it's with the medical industrial complex or the military industrial complex, it's that they've been lying. They've been lying to make their shareholders happy, or to push their own agendas, and that these colossal mistakes that have happened, that have cost, in some cases, millions of lives, haven't been mistakes. They've been overt lies, and that brings us back again to the topic of evil being afoot in the world. Because a mistake is one thing, but when you start talking about people who lie, and that results in millions of deaths, you start entering into some dark territory. I was chatting with some nurses yesterday about being at war, and some people found it hyperbolic that we were saying, like, we're at war right now. These things that are going on with the medical industrial complex in the U.S. and the health of U.S. citizens, like, this is a war. Mm-hmm. And my justification for supporting that statement is you literally have to look at wartime atrocities to find a similar death toll to what some of these companies are doing to us. When you look at the opioid epidemic, when you look at things like Vioxx, when you look at things like Zantac causing cancer, and they knew it in the early 80s, Johnson & Johnson baby powder having asbestos in it that caused cancer, and they knew it in the 70s. Like, the death toll from some of these scandals, like, you can only look at things like Pol Pot and the killing fields and the Holocaust to find similar numbers of people that have been hurt.
As you know, we've been partnering with the Wellness Company for several months now. And personally, as someone who sadly no longer trusts the vast majority of medical professionals, I am so happy to be able to share the Wellness Company's array of products with the Love and Life community. Dan and I just purchased the Wellness Company's medical emergency kit, which includes vital medications with proven safety profiles like ivermectin, amoxicillin, and Z-Pak. The kit also includes a comprehensive guidebook researched and written by the company's chief medical board, including esteemed doctors who stood up to COVID tyranny, by the way, which is exactly why they've earned our trust. Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Drew Pinsky, and Dr. Paul Alexander, just to name a few. Head over to twc.health/lovelife and enter promo code LOVELIFE, all one word, for 15% off your order. That's twc.health/lovelife and promo code LOVELIFE for 15% off your order. We can take charge of our health, and the Wellness Company is here to help us do it. Getting back to the point about pharma, we do see there's the series Dope Sick, which I had the honor of interviewing the author of the book Dope Sick, and she had just, right before recording with me, she had been in Hollywood with Michael Keaton at some event to promote the series. It was on Hulu, and then we recently had Painkiller with Matthew Broderick, and I think that's on Netflix. And so we see these depictions of exactly what's going on, and they're quite. I mean, Painkiller, they show the Sackler family and how maniacal they are, and yet I still have friends like, oh no, I can trust these drugs. I'm just gonna pop a couple Xanax. I'm like, what are you doing? I just don't understand. You see that they are corrupt. They don't care. They will spin any study. They will pay off the researchers the strange thing is they can fund their own studies and then submit them to the FDA, which is ridiculous. They only have to have 2 that look to be beneficial before they can get a drug approved. But you see, and sometimes I'm like, how did they even let this documentary or this miniseries or whatever it is, how they even let that be posted or published? I'm not saying the word right, but how do they even let it be aired? Because it could influence people's minds to actually wake up to what's going on with these entities. But I think that they just know that the propaganda is so deep that people watch that and be like, well, that was bad about what was the one? I'm forgetting the Sackler. OxyContin.
OxyContin.
Yeah, that was bad about OxyContin, but all these other drugs, no problem.
Yeah, it reminds me of the work of Matthias Desmet, who talks about what is
Mass
it called? Mass formation
formation.
psychosis. Yeah, where there's 10% of people that are always going to be really, really difficult to propagandize. I feel like that's maybe the people we talked about earlier who were homeschooled and who were going to church and who were out the first ones out there on the picket line. And then there's about 20% of people who will always fall for the propaganda, who are never going to wake up, who are always going to defer to authority and never really engage in I don't know what you would call it, not necessarily critical thinking, but that they're always going to have that deference for authority. And then there's the rest of us in the middle, this 70% who are reachable, But how do you reach them when you're being censored? I think that for a lot of people, unfortunately, the wake up call only happens when something happens to them directly or toward one of their loved ones, where they have to see it firsthand, where they have to see their child change after vaccination or something like that. But then a lot of the time, even when it's right there in front of them, it's still too uncomfortable to open that door. And again, I kind of understand that because ignorance is bliss, and it is wildly uncomfortable. It's been really uncomfortable to me, to think back on all these conversations I've had with patients where I've talked to them about the medication they're starting, like the antidepressant that's going to fix the chemical imbalance that's causing their depression, because that's what I was taught to say. That's what my nursing textbook said. But now I'm in communities of people who have been incredibly harmed by medications like antidepressants. There's a condition called PSSD, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And sexual dysfunction is an incredibly common side effect of SSRIs. In fact, compared to placebo, SSRIs are more effective at causing sexual dysfunction than they are at actually improving depression. Not that they, saying that they have very low efficacy compared to placebo doesn't mean that they themselves are a placebo. They actually have profound impacts throughout your body. Most of your serotonin's in your guts, but also, again, the sexual dysfunction is incredibly prevalent and incredibly underreported and misunderstood within the psychiatric community. And what's kind of terrifying is that for some people, it ends up being permanent. They can take just a few doses of something, stop it completely, be off of it for years, and they're still completely dysfunctional. So now you have this medication that's robbed them of that. And you don't want to see people waking up because they've experienced that injury firsthand. We need to flip the table on a lot of these institutions in Washington and drain the swamp, as Trump said back in 2016.
Right. And I, like you, feel encouraged knowing with RFKJ, because I believe, I don't know, I mean, I'm not there, but my sense was that Trump was undermined and sabotaged by many of the people around him, because the deep state was like, okay, I don't know how this wrecking ball showed up. It's not going to happen. Because we have people who are, and again, one of my friends, she was speaking about Fauci, that he's been this public servant for his entire career. And I'm like, you see that as a good thing? I see that as a bad thing. I see that as him having many, many ways to continue to be part of this quote unquote deep state. And I think that that's what was going on. Whereas RFKJ, having been a dissident and being so courageous and many, starting with his environmental, being an environmental attorney and cleaning up the Hudson River, has been willing to go against the status quo and the powers that be. And that kind of courage, I think he knows how things work and can get in there and really, truly, like you said, drain the swamp and clean house. And to your point, too, about people having to have a personal experience, I listened to Nicole Shanahan being interviewed by Dave Smith yesterday. And I don't know her story fully, but it sounds like maybe one of her children was vaccine injured, because she alluded to a child who's not doing well. And maybe that was what it took. But like to your point, you don't want it to take that. We don't want people to have an autistic child before they understand what's going on with this CDC schedule. And we don't want them to have an inability to have a normal sexual relationship after being on antidepressant for even maybe a handful of weeks or a handful of months or a handful of years. And you and I would argue that whatever they were suffering from, the depression, was probably they were grieving. They probably had a very legitimate reason for feeling the feelings they felt, and yet they were told, which I think is so inhumane, oh, it's just a neurological chemical imbalance. That's what's going on. No, I'm probably feeling depressed because some major loss or trauma that I've experienced. And yet we are pitted as, what are you trying to do? Take away people's meds? We need our meds. And I'm thinking, I'm not the cruel one. The pharmaceutical company who's looking at your emotional state and writing it off as just neurotransmitter misfiring, they're the cruel ones.
Yeah, absolutely. In the time since you and I last spoke, I also had a conversation with an amazing woman named Kim Witzak. She calls herself the accidental advocate. You go back to the early 2000s, she and her husband had their careers locked in. They were on track. They were doing great. Her husband was part of a startup company, so they had been going at that for a few months, and it was really, really stressful. He was losing sleep. He had some insomnia, so he went to his primary care doctor to see if he could get something to help him sleep. And that doctor prescribed the SSRI sertraline, a drug made by Pfizer. And so he started taking sertraline, and he started having these horrible side effects where he felt like his head was floating outside his body, and it was he had this horrible anxiety that would leave him curled up on the floor. This is somebody who never had a panic attack in their life, and they told the doctor about it, and the doctor said, well, these medications take a few weeks to really take effect, so just keep taking it. And Kim left town on a business trip, and it was when she was out of town that she got a call from her father, who told her, we found Woody. He's hanging in the garage. He's dead. So a lawsuit came out of that, and some of the revelations from that lawsuit include that Pfizer, in their clinical trials, knew that sertraline caused insomnia. It didn't help with insomnia, but the doctor who prescribed it at the time, those clinical trials weren't released to the public, so he wouldn't have been able to know that. Also, they knew that akathisia was a possible side effect. Akathisia is a chemical terror. It's kind of like anxiety on steroids. Essentially, it's this just horrific level of anxiety. And what Pfizer talked about internally was that they said something along the lines of, death is a welcome release from the horror of experiencing akathisia. So at the same time they were developing this drug, they wanted to make primary care doctors more comfortable in prescribing it. They didn't want there to be gatekeepers where only psychiatrists could prescribe this new drug, because that would really limit the market reach of the drug. So they came up with this depression scale called the PHQ-9. It's still used nationally to this day. It's the most common depression scale people use in the doctor's office, and you would think that something like that would be the brainchild of a team of renowned psychiatrists and psychologists who would get together at a conference or something like that and come up with the best depression scale that they could come up with. No, it was invented by a guy in the marketing department of Pfizer. This was a person whose background was marketing, whose background was not psychology. Although I guess marketing is kind of a game of psychology. Yeah. But when they rolled out that depression scale, the goal was to get doctors like Woody's doctor to prescribe antidepressants, while they simultaneously were saying, you know what, primary care doctors, they don't need to know about things like akathisia. They don't need to have access to clinical trials. We're going to withhold this information from them because it would hurt sales if they knew about these things. And that is such an incredible violation of informed consent. It's people's default should never be to trust these organizations and these companies and these federal institutions until we see real change. When you hear that Pfizer got fined $2.1 billion for this, or Merck got fined, $750 million for that, that's not real justice. It might sound like it when you see it in a headline, but what we see over and over and over again is that those fines are way less than their profits. And the predators involved in killing people, they get a career boost. They get promotions. The vice president of clinical research at Merck, who designed the clinical trial to hide cardiac side effects, is CEO of a different pharma company right now. The CEO at the time at Merck, he's on a board at Harvard. Meanwhile, you see people who tweet things about COVID vaccines that go against the narrative. They have their LinkedIn accounts deleted. Mm-hmm. All these pharma executives who have killed Americans by the hundreds of thousands, their LinkedIn accounts are still up. But you take down people like Robert Malone and Peter McCullough. If we do have RFK in a disruptive role in Washington, I really want to see that. But honestly, it's not going to matter unless we have some really good people take over the Department of Justice, because we haven't had justice for these crimes in my lifetime, at the very least. And when you start pulling on some of these threads, man, these problems go back decades and decades and decades and decades. So we don't just need somebody to be disruptive at Health and Human Services. We need the Department of Justice as well, so that these predators can actually face some consequences for what they've done.
And they have the perfect foil because, well, I mean, the FDA did have to put a black box warning on SSRIs, I think in 2004, at least for children and adolescents, that SSRIs can cause suicidal and homicidal ideation. But even in the case of Woody, they had the perfect foil is that, well, his mental illness just progressed further than we thought. Instead of going, he was mildly having a hard time sleeping, and now he's suicidal. That was from the drug, but they can go, oh no, he had mental health problems and we tried our best with our medication. And see, his case was just spiraling out of control.
This is a long-standing problem in psychiatry. This goes back a long, long time. It is far easier in psychiatry to employ these predatory behaviors because you get the get out of jail free card, where you just get to blame everything on the patient. If your blood pressure med doesn't work, you can check somebody's blood pressure really easily and see, actually, this medication isn't working, or this medication's doing this, or this medication's doing that. When you give somebody a psychiatric med and it doesn't work, you just blame their mental illness. Right. It's a game they've been playing for a long time, and they've gotten it to the point where, we have tens of millions of people on these drugs in this country at this point in time. Their side effect profile is horrific. Their efficacy is it's pretty bad. There are people who would swear that these drugs have been life-saving to them, and that experience is absolutely valid. But there are so many people who they are not given informed consent, because the conversation around informed consent for starting something like an antidepressant, like if most people heard true informed consent, we wouldn't have millions of people taking these drugs. We would maybe have, tens of thousands of people taking them if they were actually told the truth. That conversation might look like something like, so this medication is called Prozac, and it's going to alter your serotonergic system in ways that we don't completely understand. In clinical trials, it was shown to be marginally better than placebo. What it does is it has a numbing effect on you. It can make things like grief and negative feelings a little more numb, but it'll also numb things like joy, and you you might experience things like anhedonia. Your significant other, your partner might notice personality changes where you're not connecting as well with them. The prevalence of sexual side effects is very, very high, and those side effects for some people are permanent even after you stop taking the medication. So how many people are going to start an antidepressant if they're told all those things? There might be those people who are so crippled by their depression that they can't even get out of bed. Those are some of the people who do benefit from them from some point in time, but we're just greasing the wheels to sling them to as many people as possible and creating a system where all these providers, the psychiatrists and nurse practitioners are they've got their docket of people to see for the day, and they've got their 17 minutes that they're allotted, and they're just trained in school to follow this algorithm. You come in, you ask the person these questions, you plug things into the prescribing algorithm, and you hand them a script, and you're on to the next one, and you have to see X number of people, or you don't even get paid that day. And it's just it's so broken, it's so predatory, and the psych patients are taken advantage of more than any other area in medicine, in my opinion. But that's probably just because I'm biased, because I'm in psychiatry. I've never worked in other areas. What do you think, Karen?
No, I was just going to concur, because even to the DSM, they change with the whims of the times. Homosexuality was a mental disorder, psychiatric illness in 1987, until 1987, I think. I mean, gender dysphoria was a thing until 5 minutes ago, and now it's no problem to decide that you're a different sex. So to your point, we can get a metric, we can get an actual number for blood pressure or for how much sugar is in your system. There's no test for ADHD. Even to this day, they want to act like every little boy is ADHD. We don't have a blood test for it. We have neurological scans, but they're not really clear cut either. And just because you see some brain functioning that's a little bit different, it doesn't necessarily constitute the ability to diagnose someone. And there's a lot of things that can change with talk therapy. You can change your neural pathways through. We can solidify neural pathways that make us think in a more depressed manner through our thoughts, and we can change those neural pathways and get stronger neural pathways toward positive thinking through CBT, for example. But because pharma and psychiatry are it's one and the same, then let's make sure the DSM is just loaded with every possible diagnosis, that the only treatment plan possible is some drug that doesn't work that well, but that's okay. If you get heavy because you're on your SSRI and it's making you fat, well, we've got Ozempic for that. And if your libido's off, well, we've got Viagra. We'll figure something. They don't care. They don't care if people are on 17 meds. In fact, if they are, all the better for them.
Yeah, exactly. Everything in psychiatry is so subjective instead of objective. It just opens the door for these massive frauds, and then the patients are gaslit so bad. If a patient's given, they're trialed on a few different SSRIs and none of them seem to work, they don't look at the fact that these medications are barely more effective than a placebo in the clinical trials themselves, or less effective than a placebo. But like you said before, you only have to have 2 positive clinical trials. So I think it was Celexa. They submitted 7 clinical trial studies, and only 2 of them showed a positive result. And the FDA reviewer said something along the lines of, well, I guess by our standards, we have to approve this because you did submit 2 positive trials, but it's kind of weird that, 5 of the trials didn't show a positive result, and we're going to approve this anyway. That was back in the 90s or whatever. And of course, that system hasn't been improved since then. But you're a patient who goes on these drugs, and if they don't work for you, then all of a sudden you get labeled with treatment-resistant depression, as if it's your fault,
Oh, and then you can take Abilify, which is an antipsychotic, by the way, which obviously. I'm preaching to the choir here. I don't think most people know, I take my Prozac Chaser. It's an antipsychotic. You have depression, again, for, I'm sure, a very reasonable reason. A rational reason for you to feel this way. And now we've got you on an antipsychotic? And that's allowed thanks to the fact that we're one of only 2 countries in the world that allows direct-to-consumer marketing for drugs. I'm just so livid about it. And now, Ozempic for children. Why are kids obese? No, it's the American Pediatric Association. I think they just signed off on it for kids as young as 6 years old.
Yeah, Ozempic's one where it's like, okay, we have these companies with these track records, and this is on pace to be the most profitable pharmaceutical of all time. Like, that right there is a red flag that you need to be, you need to have your guard up. You need to be skeptical and cynical about anything you hear, because the profit incentive, historically, that's when the predatory behaviors really come out, and they still have complete control of publishers and clinical research and federal institutions. So yeah, definitely have your guard up. There's no magic pill. There's no easy way out, but that's kind of what we've been groomed to believe as a society is, whatever's wrong. I'm sure there's a pill for that, because, yay science, yay progress. We've figured out something where we can have this company swoop in and save you. And I am at a point in my life where I wouldn't go to a hospital unless, my hand has been severed down in my woodworking workshop or something like that. Like, I will avoid establishment medicine at all costs, and I'll go to the neighborhood family clinic or some sort of a holistic health practitioner for if I ever run into some sort of chronic sort of illness. But anything acute, go to a hospital. But other than that, I personally will be avoiding hospitals like the plague.
I remember, I want to bring it back to COVID as we wrap up, Dave. I remember during COVID, I was terrified because I had made a very clear choice. I was not going to take that shot. And I want to remind the listeners that you lost your job. You were Nurse of the Year the year before, and then lost your job for not wanting to take an experimental product that had never been used with humans before. You lost your job. What I'm getting at is 2 points. One, the hospital. I was terrified that I would get in a car wreck or something, and I'd have to go to the hospital for that acute care. Because like you, I don't trust any Western medicine. I'm done. And so I'm done. And I was terrified that they'd slip something in my IV. Because they would see that I was unvaccinated, and they would be like, oh, we're going to remedy that situation. Or maybe not even treat me. I know a lot of people couldn't get any kind of services they need along the lines of transplants and things. They couldn't get them if they were unvaccinated, even though we know that the vaccine, I'll say in quotes, was making it less likely that your body would accept the transplanted organ in many cases. But be that as it may, I'm terrified of the hospital as well now, and I never thought I'd be that kind of person. And secondly, where do you go with this? I get the sense, again, bringing it back to COVID, and I'm going to show anyone who's watching that I have my Defeat the Mandates shirt on, which was from January of 2022. And last time Dave and I realized that we were both there before we knew each other. And there's another protest coming up called Rescue the Republic by Dr. Brett Weinstein is in charge of it. And a lot of people are going to be there. Some of the folks we've talked about, Pierre Corey, Russell Brand's going to be there, Tulsi Gabbard, Brett Weinstein's wife, Heather Heying. So a lot of the dissidents, the people who've been courageous enough to lose jobs, to lose respect by many folks, but to gain the respect of those of us who were looking to those scientists, and in the case of Brett and Heather, they're biologists. We needed those folks in the community to say, no, this is not science. This is the opposite of science. Science should always be questioned. You can't say this, follow the science. That's like a contradiction in terms. You always let science continue to question. But when you hear someone, I get the sense that a lot of people just want us to move on from COVID. Like, It's over, Karen. Like, it's over. Sorry you had such a rough time. But, and the one friend that will talk to me, she'll say things like, everyone was traumatized. Like, I showed her this clip one time, this video, we'll send each other things, where it was all these talking heads on TV from Rachel Maddow lying about, if you get the shot, COVID will stop with you. You won't transmit it. You won't get it. lies, 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 lies. Fauci said it, Biden said it. And then all the vitriol that came from, I mean, I've never experienced the president of the United States go on national television and look me in the eye and say that it's my fault that this thing is ravaging its way through the country. It's my fault. It's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. And your patience is wearing thin, Joe Biden, is it? Because you're not my father. You are not the boss of me. I supposedly live in a free country. Like, I'm still livid about all this. And I feel that people want me to just move on. And to the point we were talking about earlier, I recognize that I have so much energy about that I probably am not presenting it in a way, like you said, that 70% of people who might have some wiggle room, I'm probably coming at them too hard. and I think they are, because also in the midst of this, and I think I talked about this a little bit while you were talking earlier, I was thinking about this too. It's not only that we were dissidents, it's that even since the Flexner report, the Rockefellers have bought out the medical schools. So anyone who talks about holistic, naturopathic interventions is a quack. So we're not only dissidents, we were selfish because we weren't going to take a shot and we're going to kill grandma. We were very much painted not as folks who said, hey, I just want to be a critical thinker and I want to just do with my body what I want to do with my body. No. We were vilified in ways that I think made people who disagreed with us feel very self-righteous, that they were allowed to have that energy of hatred for us and our stance.
Oh, yeah, it was very empowering for them. They got to assume both the intellectual and moral high ground. And oh, man, they loved it. It was an amazing feeling for them that they got to look down on us and feel so superior, feel so much smarter, feel so much like, well, I did the right thing. You're just a selfish hypocrite. And you know, that's part of why so many people are unreachable, is because they loved that intoxicating feeling of being told that they have that high ground, and to reconcile that was actually a lie, that they were lied to and that they believed lies. Like that's a pretty big hit on their ego. That's a pretty big hit on their self-identity. You know, if you're one of these people who works in the hospital and you didn't just support the mandates, but you gave your patients remdesivir and you slapped patients on ventilators and you sat around the nurses station and you talked smack about unvaccinated people and you were mean to family members and you engaged in all these behaviors, it's going to be incredibly difficult to reconcile that you were wrong and that you actually did a lot of harm. And I can identify with that because I did that in my career in psychiatry when I was ignorant about the medications that I was giving people. When I would look back later and you know, I trained people, I talked to thousands of patients, I helped orient new staff, I did all these things where I was a good system puppet essentially for these establishment systems. Doesn't feel good. Does not feel good to recognize that you participated in that. So I do kind of understand why some people still resist, but obviously, no, we can't let this go. We can't put it behind us. Why not? Because, well, we put Vioxx behind us. We apparently put SSRIs behind us. We apparently put OxyContin behind us. Like I said before, we have not seen justice for any of these things. We need to see some justice for these systems to change. We can't just keep saying, oh, there was another pharma scandal. A few 100,000 Americans have been killed. But, you know, it's painful to talk about, so let's just put it behind us. Like, no, we can't put it behind us because, again, the health crisis that we face in this country, between things like autoimmune disease and obesity and cancer and autism and the fertility rate, these are all existential crises, and you pull the threads, they come back to the same players, and we have to change this system, and we have to do it as soon as possible, because we're already at the edge of the cliff, if not over already.
Yeah, and that's where to end on a positive note, I am so grateful for, like we talked about a bit ago, there are people from all walks of life who maybe 10 years ago we would have thought we didn't have that much in common with, and we're coming together, we're coalescing, being able to be at a rally. We want to make a statement, but we also want to find that common ground with people and know we're not alone, because it can feel very isolating if you're one of the only people in your social community that's a dissident, and hope to, again, gather tools to speak in love. Because I think, to your point, there's a psychological desire to protect your position on something. And like you said, it was probably hard for you to awaken and go, dang, I was part of doing harm. I thought I was doing the right thing. I wasn't. That's not easy to, we've talked quite a bit today about those frameworks that we establish in our worldview. And when we have to poke at them or pull one of those house of cards out of the house, it gets very, it's a crisis moment, really. A crisis of understanding of our values, of our philosophies. And some of us have been willing to do that. Some of us maybe didn't want to do that, but COVID just smacked us in the face and we went, okay, something's going on, and it's quite different from what I thought the world was. But I'm hoping that we can find ways to reach people with that common humanity. And again, to your point you mentioned earlier, find that really we've been pitted against each other. And one thing we should all care about is all of us as Americans, and also as people who care about the rest of the world, to look at when we're healthy, when we're strong, that's the foundation. If you don't have your health, you have nothing. So to find that, and that's why I was so happy that RFKJ was, of course, that's his key platform, free speech also, but those are his biggest platforms, and he's integrating that seamlessly with this MAHA, and hoping to go, all right, can we just stop with all the polarization and remember we all want healthy lives, we all want healthy children, and to the extent that we have to wake up and think and recognize that there are entities at work, big, powerful corporations that do not want that. It's clear. Let's just be open to that. Let's, for the good of all of us, instead of going, I'm on this team, you're on that team, and if I believe this, then whatever you believe must be quackery, and getting into that place of dissension. And so I'm hoping that we can coalesce. That's my prayer.
Yeah, that is a very positive thing that's come out of this whole COVID situation, is that these people who never would have met, never would have aligned. Brett Weinstein talks about this, about how he calls it Goliath, whether you want to call it the deep state or the swamp. The error that Goliath made over the course of COVID was that all these people have found themselves to be like-minded and have put aside other differences because they recognize the existential fight that we're in right now, and it's kind of a dream team. That's been something that's happened with these very prominent people like Brett and like Russell Brand and Tucker and Naomi Wolf, but it's also happened at the local level too. I've met and made new friends that it never would have happened if COVID hadn't happened, and I've certainly lost things. It's been hard on relationships. Obviously, I lost my job, but at the same time, like, I never would have met some really amazing people if all this hadn't happened. And so I'm absolutely grateful for that, and I am hopeful that we're gonna get this thing turned around, because that's definitely a silver lining, that people are waking up to just how high the stakes are and just how imminent the need for action is.
Yeah, and that's I want to leave on that positive note, because it's a dark and heavy subject, and I'm just so thankful for your work and your advocacy and for your time today, and I look forward to speaking with you again if you'll be willing to come, and because there's a lot coming down the pike. So this issue continues to grow and evolve and be. I don't want to be that person who's scared to be hopeful, but I am hopeful and also a little bit guarded, just because we know that the Goliath is a big foe. But just connecting with people like you and other like-minded individuals who are just stepping up and are heroes, those those professionals who were just willing to lose everything, and like you, willing to lose your job for your values and your commitment to truth. And so thank you so much, Dave, for all your work and for joining us today.
I appreciate it, Karen. I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thanks so much.
Love and Life is produced by Tim May and host and executive producer Dr. Karen Anderson April.